My parents left a beautifully wrapped box on my front porch with a single terrifying warning: do not make a scene. I tore the paper away and my entire universe instantly collapsed. Trembling uncontrollably, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw the police officers standing in our living room, and turned completely pale. Please do not tell me they actually did it. My name is Clara. I am 34 years old and a forensic accountant who spent my career uncovering hidden truths in complex financial records. But nothing could have prepared me for the devastating betrayal hiding inside my own family. If you have ever had your world shattered by the people who share your blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe. You will not believe how far my parents went, and how far I went to make them pay. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The neighborhood was quiet as I pulled my car into the driveway of our suburban home. I had just finished a grueling shift at the firm, staring at spreadsheets and tracing missing funds. All I wanted was to walk through my front door, drop my briefcase, and hug my 6-year-old son Leo. I had legally adopted Leo when he was just a baby. He was the light of my life, a bright, energetic boy who meant everything to me. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed a familiar luxury sedan speeding away from the end of my street. The taillights belonged to my parents, Harrison and Caroline. I frowned, wondering why they would visit without calling, especially since our relationship had been strained for years. I walked up the stone pathway. Sitting perfectly centered on the welcome mat was a square box. It was wrapped in elegant silver paper tied with a pristine white ribbon. It looked exactly like the expensive gifts my mother always bought. Tucked under the ribbon was a thick cardstock envelope. I set my keys down and pulled the card out. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother Caroline's elegant cursive. The message was brief and chilling. Do not make a scene. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I ripped the silver paper off the box and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of white tissue paper, was a thick black rubber strap cut cleanly in half. It was a child-sized GPS tracking bracelet. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact bracelet I clasped around Leo's wrist every morning before school. My hands began to shake violently. A second piece of paper fluttered out of the box and landed by my shoes. I picked it up. Again, it was my mother's handwriting. The words burned into my vision. He is with his real family now. Panic seized my chest. I threw the front door open and rushed inside. The house was completely silent. There were no cartoons playing on the television, no sound of small feet running across the hardwood floors. I dropped my briefcase and started screaming his name. Leo. I ran into the kitchen. Empty. I sprinted up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into his bedroom. His bed was made, but his favorite dinosaur backpack was gone. His closet door was open, and a few of his jackets were missing. I stumbled backward into the hallway, my mind struggling to process the impossible nightmare unfolding around me. My parents had taken my son. They had cut off his tracking device, left it on my doorstep as a sick trophy, and taken him. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My fingers were slick with cold sweat, making it difficult to unlock the screen. I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear as I paced frantically down the stairs. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm. My son is gone, I gasped, struggling to pull air into my lungs. My parents took him. They left a box on my porch with his cut tracking bracelet and a note. Please, you have to help me. He is only 6 years old. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm, the dispatcher said. What is your address and what is your son's name? I rattled off my address and gave them Leo's description. I told them about the silver car speeding away. The dispatcher assured me that officers were being dispatched immediately and instructed me to stay exactly where I was. I hung up the phone and sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying my face in my hands. My baby was gone. The weight of that realization crushed me. I stared at the severed black rubber of the GPS bracelet, imagining my parents forcing it off his tiny wrist. 5 agonizing minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated my living room windows. I rushed to the front door and threw it open before the two officers could even knock. They stepped inside, their expressions serious and alert. I handed them the severed GPS bracelet and the two handwritten notes. I was speaking a mile a minute, my voice cracking as I explained the deeply strained dynamic with my parents. I begged them to issue an Amber Alert immediately. The older officer pulled out a notepad and began taking meticulous notes, asking detailed questions about custody arrangements. Just as the officer was asking for a recent photograph of Leo to circulate to other patrol units, the front door clicked and opened again. My husband David walked in. He was wearing his tailored work suit, holding his expensive leather briefcase, looking completely ordinary. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the police officers standing in our brightly lit hallway. His eyes darted frantically from the officers to my tear-stained and panicked face, and finally down to the severed tracking bracelet resting next to the notes on the entry table. Instead of dropping his briefcase in shock, instead of rushing over to comfort his terrified wife, instead of frantically asking what had happened to our son David, just stood there. His face completely drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He let out a shaky, trembling breath, slowly looked down at the hardwood floor, and uttered the words that would violently destroy the final remaining pillar of my reality. "Please do not tell me they actually did it." The silence that followed his words was absolute and suffocating. The air in my living room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I stared at the man I had married, the man who had held my hand in the courtroom the day we finalized Leo's adoption. My brain, trained for years to analyze data and uncover hidden discrepancies, immediately went to work on his face. I noticed the slight tremor in his jaw. I saw the bead of sweat forming at his temple. I registered the way his knuckles were turning stark white around the leather handle of his briefcase. He knew. My husband knew my parents were coming to take our 6-year-old son. "David," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow and distant, as if it were coming from someone else entirely. "What do you mean they actually did it? What did you know about this?" The older police officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. His eyes narrowed as he evaluated David. "Sir, care to explain what you meant by that statement? Your wife here just reported an abduction." David's eyes darted wildly around the room for a fraction of a second. Then I watched something terrifying happen right in front of me. I watched my husband completely erase the panic from his features. The nervous sweat seemed to vanish. He rolled his shoulders back, put on the charismatic, polished smile he used to charm his wealthy investment clients, and let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Officers, I am so incredibly sorry for wasting your time," David said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. He walked past me, entirely closing the distance between himself and the two policemen. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. There is no kidnapping. My wife is just extremely exhausted." I recoiled as if he had struck me across the face. "What are you talking about?" "They took Leo. They cut his bracelet off." David turned to me with a look of manufactured pity. It was the exact kind of look you give a confused, irrational child in public. "Clara, honey, we talked about this last night. Remember, we agreed that your parents were going to take Leo to their estate for a few days so you could get some rest. You have been working 80-hour weeks at the accounting firm. You are completely burned out." "I never agreed to any of that," I screamed, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of our home. "I never spoke to them. They left a box on the porch. Look at the note, David. Look at the severed bracelet." The younger officer picked up the pieces of the black rubber strap from the entry table and held them up to the light. "Sir, this tracking device was forcefully removed, and the handwritten note implies the child was taken permanently." David let out an easy, dismissive chuckle. The sound made the blood in my veins run ice cold. "Officers, please. You have to understand my mother-in-law. Caroline has a flair for the dramatic. She hates that tracking bracelet. She has always argued that it makes Leo look like a criminal. She probably snipped it off the second she put him in her car because it was scratching his wrist. And the note. It is just her passive-aggressive way of saying she thinks they provide a better environment for him during the weekends. It is a family dispute, not a federal crime." I could see it happening right in front of my eyes. The officers' postures relaxed. The thick tension in the room began to dissipate. The older officer unclipped his radio, signaling to dispatch that the immediate threat level had dropped. David was wearing an expensive tailored suit. He spoke clearly, calmly, and with deep authority. I was standing in my rumpled work clothes, hyperventilating, crying, and shouting. In the eyes of the law at that exact moment, he was the reliable voice of reason, and I was the hysterical, overworked mother who simply forgot a family arrangement. "David, you are lying," I said, grabbing his arm and digging my nails into his expensive wool sleeve. "Tell them the truth. Tell them you did not know they were coming." David gently but firmly peeled my fingers off his arm. He looked at the officers and shook his head with an expression of deep sorrow. "She has not been sleeping, gentlemen. The financial audits at her firm are tearing her apart. She has been having severe memory lapses, episodes of sudden paranoia. I asked her parents to step in and take Leo for a few days to keep him out of this toxic environment while I get her some psychiatric help." "Psychiatric help?" I gasped. My own husband was building an invisible cage around me brick by brick. Every single word he spoke was meticulously designed to strip away my credibility. He was not just covering for my toxic parents, he was actively discrediting my sanity to the authorities. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his tone shifting from protective to placating. "Are you currently under the care of a doctor for any mental health issues?" "No!" I shouted, waving my hands in sheer frustration. "I am a forensic accountant. I am perfectly sane. My parents stole my child and my husband is covering it up." "Clara, stop," David commanded. The sharpness in his voice was real this time, carrying a heavy warning. He turned back to the police. "I am Leo's legally adoptive father. I am on all the paperwork. I gave my full explicit consent for my in-laws to take my son tonight. He is perfectly safe. He is with his grandparents. There is absolutely no kidnapping here." The officers exchanged a weary glance. It was the exact look police officers give each other when they realize they have been dragged into a messy domestic dispute instead of a real emergency. "Sir," the younger officer said, pulling out a clipboard and a pen, "you are stating for the official record that you are the legal father and you consented to the child leaving the premises with his grandparents." "Yes, officer." "I did," David stated without a single ounce of hesitation. "Then there is absolutely nothing we can do here," the older officer said, closing his small notepad and adjusting his belt. "Ma'am, if your husband has equal custody rights and he consented to the child going with family, no crime has been committed today. If you disagree with the arrangement, you will have to take it up in family court during normal business hours." "But they cut his tracker," I pleaded, hot tears streaming down my face as desperation set in. "They left a threatening note on my porch. Property damage of a rubber bracelet by a family member does not warrant an arrest, ma'am," the officer replied, his voice totally devoid of any remaining sympathy. "And the note, while certainly unpleasant, is not a direct threat of physical violence. It is a civil matter. I suggest you and your husband sit down and discuss your parenting arrangements. Have a good evening." They turned their backs on me. I watched in absolute paralyzing disbelief as the two officers walked out of my front door, stepped off the porch, and drove their cruiser away into the dark street. The flashing lights disappeared, leaving me in total darkness. The front door clicked shut. The heavy deadbolt slid into place. I was completely alone in my living room with a monster wearing my husband's face. The man I had shared a bed with, built an entire life with, and trusted with my heart, had just looked the police in the eye and handed our 6-year-old son over to my abusive parents. He had painted me as a delusional, unstable woman just to protect them. The betrayal did not just break my heart, it incinerated it into ash. David did not immediately turn to look at me. He stood by the front door for a long moment, waiting until the faint glow of the police cruiser taillights completely faded from our neighborhood street. Then the tension melted from his shoulders. He casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, walked past me as if I were a piece of furniture, and headed straight for the mahogany wet bar in the corner of our living room. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal glass in the dead silence of the house. "How much?" I asked. My voice was eerily steady. "How much did they pay you to sell our son to my sister?" David took a slow sip of his drink. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He looked relieved. He set his glass down, walked over to his leather briefcase, resting on the entry table, and snapped the brass locks open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound stack of legal documents. He walked back to the living room and tossed the heavy file onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "I suggest you read those before you go making any more frantic phone calls to the authorities," David said, taking another sip of his bourbon. "You will save yourself a lot of public embarrassment." I stared at the thick manila folder. My hands shook as I reached for it. I flipped open the cover. The crisp white pages inside were covered in dense, intimidating legal jargon. At the top of the very first page, a bold embossed letterhead stared back at me. It was the logo of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. The firm where my brother-in-law Jamal was a senior partner. Jamal was an incredibly influential African-American attorney. He wore custom-tailored suits, commanded every courtroom he walked into, and made a living finding and exploiting the tiniest legal loopholes for billionaire clients. He was married to my younger sister Chelsea. And right there on the documents resting in my shaking hands, Jamal had orchestrated his masterpiece. It was a petition for the transfer of temporary physical and legal custody. The paperwork outlined a comprehensive agreement granting full daily care of Leo to Chelsea and Jamal. It was complete with medical release forms, educational transfer authorizations, and a deeply disturbing psychological evaluation summary. The summary, drafted by a private doctor I had never met, detailed my supposed severe occupational burnout, sleep deprivation, and emotional instability. It painted a picture of a mother who was fundamentally unfit to provide a safe home environment. And at the very bottom of the final page, right next to the shiny gold seal of a notary public, was David's signature, written in bold blue ink. "He is my son." I breathed out the words, catching in my throat. "I am his mother. You cannot just sign him away. I am his legal co-adoptive parent." "Clara," David replied coolly, swirling the ice in his glass. "We went through the adoption process together. My name is on the decree. Under the law, my signature carries the exact same weight as yours. And since I am functioning as the stable, rational parent in this household, my consent for a temporary relocation is legally binding." My eyes darted across the pages. As a forensic accountant, I spent my life reading contracts, finding the hidden traps in financial ledgers. I could see exactly what Jamal had done. He had not filed this as a hostile custody takeover. He had framed it as an emergency family intervention. Because David, the legal father, had invited Chelsea and Jamal to take Leo for his own protection, the police had zero jurisdiction. Any judge looking at this would see a father making a tough but loving choice for his child, while his wife suffered a mental breakdown. Jamal had sealed every single exit. He had built a flawless legal cage. If I went to the police precinct tomorrow, they would look at these papers and turn me away. If I hired a family lawyer, it would take months, maybe years, to get a hearing. And during those years, Leo would be living in Chelsea's sprawling mansion, being raised by the sister who had always been completely envious of everything I had. Chelsea was the family favorite. She had the wealth, the status, the perfect marriage to a high-powered lawyer. But she could not have children. Her past DUI convictions and reckless behavior had disqualified her from every legitimate adoption agency in the state. My parents had always viewed my adoption of Leo as an unfair twist of fate. They genuinely believed Chelsea deserved a child more than I did. And now they had simply taken mine. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked, my voice finally breaking. I dropped the documents onto the table. "Why would you destroy our family for them?" David finished his drink and set the glass down hard. "Because Chelsea wanted a son, Clara. Because your parents wanted to give their favorite daughter the one thing her money could not buy. And because an arrangement was made that benefits everyone involved." He did not elaborate on the arrangement. He just walked toward the stairs, unfastening his tie. He paused on the bottom step and looked back at me. His eyes were completely void of the man I thought I loved. "Do not fight this, Clara. Jamal has a dozen judges in his pocket. Your parents have bottomless bank accounts. You are a mid-level accountant. If you drag this into a courtroom, Jamal will use your work hours and this hysterical reaction against you. You will lose and you will bankrupt yourself in the process. Just accept it. Let Chelsea be a mother. Go to sleep." He turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me entirely alone in the center of our living room. The silence pressed against my ears. My husband, the man who had vowed to protect our family, had just sold our son to my sister with the stroke of a pen. He was walking up to our bedroom to sleep completely unbothered by the fact that our 6-year-old boy was currently terrified in a stranger's house. I looked down at the severed GPS bracelet resting on the table next to Jamal's flawless legal trap. A normal mother would have collapsed. A normal mother would have fallen to the floor and wept until she passed out from the pain. But as I stared at David's signature, the crushing grief inside my chest began to harden into something else, something dangerous. David was right about one thing. I was an accountant. And accountants do not scream. We do not throw tantrums. We follow the paper trail. I slowly picked up the forged psychological evaluation and Jamal's custody agreement. I was completely alone. The police were gone. The law was currently being used as a weapon against me. But they had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I was just a woman they could break. They forgot that I made a living destroying people who thought they could hide their dirty secrets behind fake paperwork. I did not scream. I did not throw a single object across the room. The hysterical weeping mother David had just successfully described to the police was completely gone. In her place stood a forensic accountant with a singular, terrifying focus. I walked straight into the kitchen, grabbed a heavy-duty travel duffel bag from the hall closet, and marched directly into my home office. I completely bypassed the framed family photos resting on the desk. I ignored the wedding anniversary portrait hanging on the wall. I reached for the heavy encrypted laptop I used exclusively for federal audits and shoved it into the bag. It was the only weapon I needed right now. Next, I walked into the master bathroom. I grabbed my toothbrush, a handful of travel toiletries, and a spare phone charger. I slid my diamond engagement ring off my finger. The cold metal clinked sharply as I dropped it directly into the porcelain sink. Let it wash down the drain for all I cared. I was never sleeping in this house again. As I moved methodically through the dark, silent house, pulling a few practical pieces of clothing from the guest room closet, my mind began to dissect the motive. In my line of work, you always follow the motive before you follow the money. Financial crimes are rarely about the cash itself. They are about ego. They are about supreme entitlement. And nobody in the entire state of Connecticut had more aggressive entitlement than my younger sister Chelsea. Chelsea was the undisputed golden child of the family. From the exact moment she was born, my parents Harrison and Caroline had treated her like absolute royalty. She was the beautiful, charismatic socialite who married a high-powered corporate lawyer. She lived in a sprawling 10-bedroom estate in the wealthiest zip code in the county. She drove imported sports cars and hosted lavish charity galas that routinely landed her on the cover of local society magazines. In my parents' eyes, Chelsea was the pinnacle of human success. She was the perfect trophy they could eagerly parade in front of their wealthy country club friends. I, on the other hand, was merely the reliable workhorse, the boring, practical older daughter who married a mid-level investment broker and adopted a child because I could not conceive naturally. My parents tolerated me, but they worshipped Chelsea. However, there was one glaring, inescapable crack in Chelsea's flawless manufactured reality. She was completely irreparably infertile. Chelsea had spent the last 4 years desperately trying to have a baby. She and Jamal threw hundreds of thousands of dollars at the absolute best fertility specialists in the country. When those expensive medical treatments inevitably failed, they confidently turned to private adoption. But Chelsea's reckless past refused to stay buried. During her wild 20s, Chelsea had racked up 2 severe driving under the influence convictions. She had literally crashed a luxury vehicle into a commercial storefront while heavily intoxicated, resulting in a mountain of legal trouble that Jamal had barely managed to sweep under the rug. Money can buy a lot of influence, but it cannot buy a clean criminal record when rigorous federal background checks are involved. Every single reputable adoption agency looked at Chelsea's 2 DUI convictions, evaluated her highly narcissistic psychological profile, and flatly rejected her application. She was deemed entirely unfit to adopt a child. I vividly remembered the family dinner right after she received her final rejection letter from a prestigious agency. Chelsea had sobbed hysterically at the dining table, screaming and throwing her wine glass, complaining about how unfair the universe was to her. My mother, Caroline, had held Chelsea's hand and glared at me across the table. I watched Caroline look over at Leo, who was happily playing with his toy cars on the living room rug, and then look back at Chelsea with an expression of deep, calculating resentment. It was the exact look of a ruthless woman negotiating a business transaction. I did not realize it at the time, but that was the precise moment my parents decided my son would be the convenient solution to Chelsea's problem. To Harrison and Caroline, this was simple mathematics. Chelsea had the massive mansion, the elite social circle, and the unlimited bank accounts. I only had a modest suburban house and an exhausting 80-hour work week. In their twisted, deeply toxic reality, they genuinely believed they were doing Leo a favor. They eagerly convinced themselves that shifting him from the working-class sister to the wealthy sister was a lifestyle upgrade. They viewed my beautiful boy not as a human being with a mother who loved him, but as a luxury asset to be forcefully redistributed to the favored heir. They just needed a legal loophole to bypass the strict adoption agencies that had rightfully rejected Chelsea. They needed a back door, and David, my cowardly, greedy husband, was the key that unlocked that door. Jamal had undoubtedly drafted the paperwork, knowing perfectly well that if the legal father willingly signed over physical custody, the state would not immediately flag it as an illegal adoption. It would just look like a temporary family arrangement. They thought they had completely outsmarted the justice system. They thought they had outsmarted me. I zipped my duffel bag shut. The metallic sound was incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the hallway. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. David was walking around in our master bedroom completely unbothered, likely getting ready to sleep soundly after literally selling our child. A sickening wave of revulsion washed over me, but I forced it down into the pit of my stomach. Anger is hot, loud, and messy. True vengeance needs to be freezing cold. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked out the front door. The crisp night air hit my face, clearing the last lingering traces of shock from my mind. I locked the deadbolt behind me, stepped off the porch, and walked straight to my car. I threw my bags into the passenger seat and started the engine. I did not look back at the house even once. The life I had built inside those walls was officially dead, and I had absolutely no intention of mourning it until my son was safely back in my arms. I drove out of the neighborhood, my hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute precision. I needed a highly secure location, a place where David could not easily find me, a place where I could connect my encrypted laptop to a secure server and begin tearing his entire life apart piece by piece. I navigated toward a nondescript business hotel on the outskirts of the city, a place favored by traveling corporate contractors. It was anonymous, highly secure, and featured the high-speed fiber optic internet I desperately required. As I pulled onto the highway, the digital clock on the dashboard read 2 in the morning. Jamal and Chelsea were probably celebrating in their massive estate, right now tucking Leo into a designer bed, completely convinced they had claimed total victory. They assumed I would spend the night crying on the kitchen floor, paralyzed and defeated by the legal paperwork Jamal had shoved in my face. They thought I was just a mid-level number cruncher who would eventually surrender to their immense wealth and influence. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to unleash a digital hellfire that would leave them begging for mercy. I pulled into the parking lot of the Executive Suites Hotel just as the first hints of pre-dawn gray began to bleed into the night sky. I paid cash for the room, avoiding any digital footprint that David could trace. The room was aggressively sterile. Beige walls, a firm king-size bed, and a solid laminate desk facing a blank wall. It was exactly what I needed. A tactical bunker stripped of any emotional attachments. I locked the deadbolt, engaged the heavy security chain, and walked straight to the desk. I pulled my encrypted work laptop from the duffel bag and flipped open the screen. The machine hummed to life, the cooling fan a steady metallic whisper in the dead quiet of the room. I plugged in my secure proxy router, masking my IP address through a network of encrypted federal servers. For the next 8 hours, I was no longer a grieving mother or a betrayed wife. I was a digital predator, and I had caught the scent of blood. In forensic accounting, we have a fundamental rule. People lie, but numbers never do. Words can be manipulated by slick corporate lawyers like Jamal, and emotions can be weaponized by toxic narcissists like my parents. But a financial ledger is cold, hard truth. If David had willingly signed away his legal rights to our son, he did not do it out of the goodness of his heart. He did it because a very specific price had been met. I just needed to find the invoice. David always thought he was the smartest person in the room. His arrogance made him incredibly sloppy with his digital hygiene. He used the same variation of his college fraternity passcode for almost everything, and he had foolishly linked his personal phone to our shared home network cloud backup. I accessed the administrative backdoor of our shared iCloud account, bypassing the two-factor authentication by routing the verification prompt to a mirrored device protocol I used for corporate audits. Within exactly 12 minutes, I had full unrestricted access to his entire digital life. Every email, every text message, every bank statement, and every deleted file he thought was permanently erased. I started with the obvious. Our joint checking and savings accounts. They were completely normal. Mortgage payments, grocery bills, car insurance. It was the perfect facade of a stable middle-class suburban marriage. But I knew better than to look at the front door. I went searching for the basement. Using a specialized data scraping tool, I cross-referenced his social security number with offshore banking registries and decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges. The progress bar on my screen slowly filled. Then the first red flag appeared. It was a wire transfer app hidden deep inside a folder labeled Fantasy Football League. I cracked the folder open, and the illusion of my husband completely shattered. David did not just have a casual weekend betting habit, he had a massive, raging, all-consuming gambling addiction. The sheer volume of transactions made my eyes widen. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the stale coffee I had brewed in the lobby. My eyes never left the cascading rows of data illuminating my screen. David thought his deleted trash folders were his sanctuary, but in the digital world, every deleted file is just waiting to be resurrected by someone who knows how to dig. He was betting on everything: professional football games overseas, cricket matches, underground college basketball syndicates, and offshore horse racing. The bets started small 2 years ago, $1,000 here, $5,000 there. But as I scrolled through the chronological ledger, the numbers escalated with terrifying speed. It was the classic spiral of a degenerate gambler trying to win back his catastrophic losses: 20,000, 50,000. By last spring, he was moving six-figure sums through complex networks of digital wallets to mask the origin of the funds. I dug deeper into the iCloud backups, recovering a cache of encrypted messages he had desperately tried to delete permanently. They were from untraceable burner numbers. The tone of the messages shifted drastically over the span of 6 months. At first, they were polite reminders about outstanding balances. Then they turned into aggressive demands. By August, they were explicit violent threats. One message sent precisely 4 weeks ago chilled me to the bone. It read, "Time is up, David. You owe us $500,000 by the end of the month. If the wire does not clear, we are not sending collections. We are sending a crew to your office. Say goodbye to your kneecaps, and say goodbye to your fancy investment firm. We will burn your entire life to the ground, $500,000. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair, my breath catching in my throat. David was completely underwater. His prestigious career, his physical safety, his entire pristine reputation were entirely on the line. He did not have $500,000. His investment commissions had dried up months ago, a fact he had skillfully hidden from me by shuffling credit lines. If those men showed up at his corporate firm, he would have been fired, blacklisted, and likely hospitalized. He was a cornered, desperate animal facing absolute destruction. And then, miraculously, the violent text messages stopped. Exactly 2 weeks ago, The threatening burner account went completely silent. The final message from the debt collectors simply read, "Account settled. Do not ever place a bet with our syndicate again." I stared at the glowing screen, the cold, harsh reality washing over me like ice water. David had found a lifeline. He had found $500,000 in untraceable cash to wipe his slate clean and save his own skin. And the absolute price for his salvation was exactly one 6-year-old boy. My parents had not just convinced David to give Leo to Chelsea. They had bought my son. They looked at a desperate, terrified man drowning in a $500,000 illegal gambling debt, and they handed him a life vest made of dirty money. All he had to do in exchange was sign Jamal's fraudulent custody papers and help them frame his wife as a hysterical, unfit mother. It was a perfectly executed transaction. David got his kneecaps and his career back. Chelsea got the child her money previously could not buy. And my parents got the satisfaction of providing for their golden child while finally putting me in my place. They treated my beautiful, innocent boy like a high-end commodity to be purchased, traded, and redistributed to the highest bidder. They used my husband's illegal vices to facilitate human trafficking, dressed up as a family court arrangement. I did not shed a single tear. The searing heat of betrayal had completely hardened into absolute, unbreakable focus. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet hotel room. Finding the motive was only the first step. David's gambling debt was the reason, but it was not the weapon I needed. The weapon was the money itself. $500,000 does not just magically appear without leaving a massive, glaring digital footprint. If my parents paid off his debt, that money had to cross state lines. It had to be washed. And someone had to orchestrate the massive transfer. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was time to follow the blood money, and I knew exactly who had left the trail. I launched the primary financial tracking software I routinely utilized for federal embezzlement cases. The screen flooded with cascading lines of code as the algorithm began scraping David's extensive banking history. He was an absolute creature of habit, and his massive ego was his greatest liability. He arrogantly assumed that simply deleting an application or clearing a browser history made his actions completely invisible to the outside world. He did not understand that in the modern, heavily digitized financial system, money leaves an indelible permanent fingerprint. Every single transaction, every routed penny creates a persistent digital echo. I simply had to tune out the background noise and listen for the exact right frequency. I started my hunt by isolating the specific date the violent, threatening text messages from his illegal bookies abruptly stopped. It was a Tuesday exactly 14 days ago. For a dangerous debt of $500,000 to be completely cleared in a single afternoon, there had to be a massive, instantaneous injection of capital. David did not have any tangible assets to liquidate. His personal credit was completely maxed out, and his investment commissions had dried up. The money absolutely had to be a direct wire transfer. I bypassed his standard domestic checking accounts because those were strictly maintained for show. Instead, I ran his social security number and his mother's maiden name through a secure federal database designed to flag hidden corporate entities. Within 4 minutes, a direct match popped up. It was a domestic limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware under the generic name Apex Consulting Solutions. David was explicitly listed as the sole managing director and primary beneficiary. It was a classic amateur shell account. The exact kind of pathetic setup an arrogant investment broker uses when he genuinely thinks he is starring in his own financial thriller. I breached the shell account using a brute force password sequence that targeted his predictable security habits. As the hidden ledger materialized on my laptop screen, my eyes immediately locked onto the transaction history. The account had been completely dormant for over 3 years. It held a baseline balance of $50 to avoid closure fees. Then exactly 14 days ago, the digital ledger exploded with activity. A single massive incoming wire transfer was recorded at 9 in the morning. The amount was precisely $500,000. There was no descriptive memo attached, There was no invoice reference number. It was just a massive blunt force deposit of $500,000 in pure, unadulterated cash. Less than 2 hours after the money hit the account, the entire sum was forcefully wired out in 3 separate staggered transactions. The outbound money was routed to offshore banking accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Macau. Those were the illegal sports bookies. David had received the exact amount of his gambling debt and immediately flushed the cash out to save his kneecaps and his professional career. I stared at the incoming wire transfer, my heart beating with a slow, heavy, and terrifying rhythm. Finding the deposit was the easy part of the job. Finding the actual sender was the real challenge. High-level financial transactions of this specific magnitude do not just float invisibly through the ether. They are heavily regulated by strict federal banking laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of money laundering. Whoever sent this massive amount of cash had to actively bypass the standard flagging protocols. They had to deliberately mask the origin to ensure the Internal Revenue Service did not immediately freeze the funds for suspicious activity. I ran the complex routing number of the incoming wire through my tracking software. The system began tracing the digital pathway backward, methodically peeling away the encrypted layers. The money had not come from a standard personal checking account. It was carefully routed from a high-yield corporate trust. I initiated a reverse lookup on the trust identification number. The loading icon spun on my screen for what felt like an absolute eternity. My hands hovered over the keyboard, my breathing shallow and completely controlled. Finally, the true origin of the funds decoded and flashed across my bright screen in harsh black text. The money originated directly from the primary holding account of H&C Enterprises, Harrison and Caroline, my own parents. I pushed my chair back from the desk, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen casting long, sinister shadows against the hotel room walls. The sheer, unadulterated magnitude of their depravity hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. My parents had literally bought my son. They had placed a calculated financial price tag on a human life. They looked at Leo, a bright, loving, innocent 6-year-old boy, who happily called them Grandma and Grandpa, and they treated him exactly like a piece of high-end real estate. They knew David was drowning in illegal gambling debt. They knew he was absolutely terrified of losing his lucrative career and his physical safety to violent loan sharks. But instead of helping him or bringing the terrifying issue to me, they weaponized his desperation. They offered him a $500,000 bribe to sign away his legal rights as a father. The pristine custody documents Jamal had drafted were not an emergency family arrangement to help a supposedly unstable mother. They were a literal bill of sale. David had traded his only son for his own survival, and my parents had eagerly paid the ransom just to permanently gift my child to my infertile golden child sister. Sitting in that anonymous hotel room surrounded by digital evidence of their treason, I felt the last lingering threads of daughterly affection completely disintegrate. Caroline and Harrison had always been ruthless social climbers, but this crossed into a realm of pure calculated evil. They had orchestrated a human transaction under the guise of legal paperwork. They had exploited the legal system, manipulated local law enforcement, and purchased a child to satisfy Chelsea's demands. But as I stared at the screen, a new question emerged. Harrison and Caroline were wealthy, but they were not legally savvy enough to bypass federal wire fraud triggers on their own. They needed an expert, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate trust accounts and launder $500,000 without tripping financial alarms. I leaned forward again, my eyes locked on the routing data. I needed to find the architect of this transaction. The routing data displayed on my screen was complex, intentionally convoluted to confuse standard banking algorithms. The money had not simply traveled from my parents' corporate account directly into David's pathetic shell company. It had taken a highly orchestrated detour. I engaged a packet sniffing protocol, a deep dive extraction tool we utilized at the firm specifically for untangling offshore money laundering operations. The code parsed the metadata embedded in the transaction hashes. Within minutes, the intermediary stop illuminated on my display. The $500,000 had been temporarily parked in a corporate trust account. I ran the registry numbers. It was an interest on lawyers' trust account. Specifically, the primary escrow account for the massive corporate law firm where my brother-in-law Jamal was a senior partner. A bitter, joyless laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the sterile hotel room. Jamal was an incredibly skilled attorney, but his overwhelming arrogance had just handed me the exact rope I needed to hang him. Lawyers use these specific trust accounts to hold client funds temporarily during settlements or major transactions. They are highly protected and rarely subject to routine audits because of strict attorney-client privilege laws. Jamal had deliberately weaponized his own law firm to wash my parents' dirty money. He took their bribe, scrubbed it through his pristine legal escrow, and then authorized the clean wire transfer to David. By doing this, Jamal ensured the local authorities would never see a direct financial link between Harrison Caroline and my husband. He made the purchase of my son look like an entirely untraceable ghost transaction. But Jamal made one fatal miscalculation. He severely underestimated the digital forensic capabilities of the woman whose child he just stole. I did not just want the financial ledger. I wanted the raw, undeniable proof of their conspiracy. I needed their actual words. I opened a secondary terminal window and directed my focus back to David's iCloud backups. Standard users genuinely believe that when they hit the delete button, their data vanishes into the digital abyss. But forensic accounting relies on the fundamental reality that the internet never truly forgets. I ran a deep recovery script targeting the partitioned sectors of David's email servers. I specifically filtered the search parameters for the past 30 days, cross-referencing any encrypted communications involving Harrison Caroline or Jamal. The recovery software methodically reconstructed the fragmented files. Line by line, a series of deeply buried email chains began to populate on my screen. I opened the first recovered email thread. It was dated exactly 3 weeks ago, shortly after David's loan sharks had threatened to destroy his life. The subject line was chillingly mundane. It simply read, "Family arrangement." I clicked the text and began to read the messages exchanged between my husband, my father, and my brother-in-law. The sheer transactional coldness of their words made my stomach churn violently. There was absolutely no emotion, no hesitation, and no remorse. They were not discussing the permanent trauma of tearing a 6-year-old boy away from the only mother he had ever known. They were negotiating the terms of a hostile corporate merger. Harrison sent the initial proposal. The message read, "David, Caroline, and I are well aware of your current financial crisis. We know about the $500,000 you owe. We are prepared to clear this debt entirely and secure a lucrative executive position for you at my firm. In exchange, you will execute a full transfer of your physical custody rights of Leo over to Chelsea and Jamal. You will help us portray Clara as mentally unfit to maintain a safe environment. This is a one-time offer to save your career and your life." My hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles throbbed. I scrolled down to David's response. My husband, the man who had promised to protect our family, did not even attempt to negotiate or defend his son. He simply replied, "How quickly can the funds be transferred? The collectors are getting aggressive. I need the cash cleared before the end of the month. I will sign whatever Jamal drafts, but Clara is going to fight this." The next message in the chain was from Jamal. It was the blueprint for the entire kidnapping. Jamal wrote, "Do not worry about Clara fighting it. I will draft a temporary custody agreement framed as an emergency intervention. David, as the legal CO parent, your signature gives us the authority to remove the child without triggering a police kidnapping response. I will route Harrison's money through my firm's trust account to ensure the deposit into your shell company is totally invisible to local family court audits. Once we have the boy, we will use Clara's inevitable emotional breakdown against her. Let her scream. The crazier she acts, the faster the judge will seal the transfer." I read that paragraph 4 times. The words burned into my retinas. Jamal had methodically laid out the precise legal strategy to exploit my trauma. He had instructed my husband and my parents to gaslight me to push me into a public emotional collapse so they could weaponize my grief in a courtroom. They treated my unconditional love for Leo as a convenient vulnerability to be exploited. I leaned back in the uncomfortable hotel chair, staring at the glowing screen. Jamal thought he was untouchable. He believed his status as a high-powered corporate lawyer placed him entirely above the law. He assumed that by masking the transaction through his firm's trust account, he had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. He was wrong. By structuring the payment this way, Jamal had escalated the situation far beyond a simple domestic family dispute. Washing $500,000 of extortion money through a legal trust to facilitate the illegal transfer of a minor across state boundaries was not a local civil matter. It was a massive string of federal crimes. Jamal had committed egregious wire fraud. He had actively engaged in money laundering. And by executing this transaction to forcefully relocate a child for financial gain, he had crossed the threshold into federal conspiracy. The local police officers who had turned their backs on me hours ago were completely unequipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. This was no longer a local precinct issue. I began dragging the recovered emails, the wire transfer receipts, and the trust account routing numbers into a highly encrypted password-protected folder on my desktop. I carefully labeled every single piece of evidence. I documented the exact timestamps of David's communications with the illegal betting syndicate and matched them directly against the arrival of Harrison's money from Jamal's trust account. The timeline was absolutely flawless. The digital paper trail created a perfect airtight narrative of extortion, bribery, and fraud. I watched the progress bar fill as the files copied over to my secure external hard drive. The quiet hum of the laptop felt like the steady rhythm of a ticking bomb. Jamal, Harrison, Caroline, and David had successfully built a legal cage around me tonight. But they had absolutely no idea that I was currently forging the key that would lock them inside a federal penitentiary. I had the motive, and I finally had the money trail. Now I just needed to secure the one crucial piece of evidence that would completely obliterate Jamal's fraudulent custody paperwork and bring their entire operation crashing down on their heads. Before I could pivot my focus to the legal archives, a crisp notification ping echoed from my laptop speakers. The sound startled me in the dead silence of the hotel room. I glanced at the upper right corner of my screen. Because I had established a direct mirrored connection to David's iCloud account, his live text messages were actively syncing directly to my desktop. My husband was awake and he was currently texting. I opened the messaging application interface. A flurry of chat bubbles populated the screen in real time. My eyes locked onto an active group thread. The title of the chat was simply Family Updates. I clicked on the participant list. It included David, Harrison, Caroline, Chelsea, and Jamal. I was the only family member explicitly excluded. The chat had been created 3 weeks ago, right around the time Harrison made his initial financial proposition to David. I watched the cursor blink as a new message from David appeared. It read, "The local police just left. Clara tried to file a kidnapping report, but the officers dismissed it as a civil dispute. She is completely hysterical, but she is currently packing a bag to leave the house. The coast is entirely clear." My chest tightened as I read his words. He was reporting my devastation back to my parents like a successful operative updating his handlers. He was proud of how flawlessly he had manipulated the local authorities. Almost immediately, a response from Harrison popped up. "Good work, David. I knew you could handle the situation. The wire transfer has officially cleared the trust account. Your slate is wiped clean. Welcome to your new life." A sick feeling twisted in my gut. My father was openly congratulating my husband for selling my child. There was absolutely no remorse in his digital tone. Then Chelsea entered the chat. My beautiful, perfect golden child sister who was currently sitting in her mansion with my terrified 6-year-old boy. Her text bubble appeared, and the sheer cruelty of her words took my breath away. She wrote, "Let her scream. Jamal said if she files a police report, we'll use her erratic behavior to declare her unfit. We have the psychological evaluation ready. The louder she gets, the faster the judge hands Leo over to us permanently. I stared at Chelsea's message. She was actively mocking my pain. She and Jamal were gleefully anticipating my emotional collapse so they could weaponize it in family court. They viewed my trauma not as a tragedy, but as a highly convenient legal strategy. Before I could fully process the absolute venom of Chelsea's text, my mother chimed in. Caroline, the woman who had raised me, typed a response that entirely shattered whatever fragile illusion of family I had left. Caroline wrote, "It's for the best. Leo belongs in a mansion, not with a working-class accountant. Chelsea can give him the lifestyle he actually deserves. Clara will eventually get over it." I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I read Caroline's message again. A working-class accountant. That is all I was to them. Despite my advanced degrees, despite my grueling work ethic, despite the stable home I had painstakingly built for my son, I was nothing but a lesser citizen in their elitist hierarchy. They genuinely believed that wealth and social status trumped a mother's unconditional love. They thought that a sprawling estate entitled Chelsea to steal another woman's child. The heartbreak that had been threatening to consume me entirely vanished. The suffocating grief, the paralyzing shock, the overwhelming urge to weep into my hands evaporated in a single heartbeat. In its place rose a terrifying absolute rage. It was not a chaotic screaming anger, it was a freezing crystallized fury. It was the kind of rage that sharpens your vision and slows your pulse. The kind of rage that allows a person to systematically destroy a target without feeling a single ounce of pity. I sat back in the stiff hotel chair and took a deep, steadying breath. Every lingering thread of familial obligation severed cleanly. I no longer had a mother. I no longer had a father. I no longer had a sister or a husband. I was looking at a cartel. A group of wealthy, narcissistic criminals who had conspired to traffic my child across state lines for their own selfish gratification. And they had vastly, fatally underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They assumed I would break. They thought my love for Leo would make me reckless and erratic. They were completely wrong. My love for Leo made me lethal. I highlighted the entire group chat thread. I exported the live transcript, preserving the exact timestamps, the sender identification data, and the specific phone numbers associated with each cruel message. I saved the file directly into the encrypted federal evidence folder resting on my desktop. I now had their financial records proving the extortion, and I had their written communications proving the premeditated conspiracy. I had the undeniable digital confession of 5 people coordinating a kidnapping. But I needed one final devastating strike. I needed to completely neutralize Jamal. Jamal was the architect of this entire nightmare. He had drafted the fraudulent custody transfer. He had manipulated the local police by exploiting his knowledge of civil jurisdiction. He was the legal shield protecting my family's criminal enterprise. I closed the messaging application and opened a secure portal to the State Family Court digital archives. Jamal was brilliant, but his extreme arrogance was his ultimate vulnerability. He believed he could manipulate the law because he assumed nobody would dare double-check his flawless paperwork. He assumed the documents David signed tonight were absolute and legally binding. I cracked my knuckles. My eyes locked intensely on the loading screen. Jamal had spent his entire career operating under the assumption that he was always the smartest person in the room. He had no idea that 12 months ago David and I had executed a quiet, deeply buried legal maneuver that rendered Jamal's brand new custody agreement completely null and void. I typed my security credentials into the court database. It was time to pull the trump card that would tear Jamal's legal shield to absolute shreds. I typed my security credentials into the court database. It was time to pull the trump card that would tear Jamal's legal shield to shreds. Before retrieving that file, I reached into my heavy duffel bag and pulled out the thick manila folder David had arrogantly tossed onto our coffee table hours ago. I had snatched it right before walking out the door. I spread Jamal's meticulously drafted custody agreement across the laminated hotel desk, placing it directly under the harsh desk lamp. I needed to understand the exact architecture of his deceit. Jamal was a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm. He was undeniably brilliant when it came to corporate mergers and acquisitions, but family law was not his specialty, and his overwhelming hubris had made him incredibly sloppy. As I read through the dense paragraphs of the temporary custody transfer, I could practically hear his condescending voice dripping from the pages. He had loaded the document with aggressive, intimidating legal jargon designed specifically to terrify a layman into submission. He cited obscure civil codes and framed the entire transfer as an emergency protective measure, leaning heavily on the fabricated psychological evaluation that painted me as an unstable threat to my own son. Jamal assumed I would take one look at this towering stack of legal threats and completely fold. He assumed that because my professional title was accountant, I was just a harmless spreadsheet jockey lacking the backbone to challenge his authority. He genuinely believed I would sit in my empty house paralyzed by fear of a courtroom battle against a man of his stature and accept the loss of my child as a tragic inevitability. He forgot that forensic accountants do not just add numbers. We dismantle complex criminal enterprises. We dissect fraudulent documents to find the hidden leverage points. Reading through his masterpiece of intimidation, I immediately spotted the fatal structural flaw in his design. Jamal had built his entire legal strategy on the foundation of David's consent. The document legally hinged on the premise that David, as the recognized Keo adoptive parent, possessed the autonomous right to authorize Leo's emergency relocation. Jamal was so blindingly confident in his own intellectual superiority that he never bothered to verify the fundamental baseline of David's parental rights. He never ran a deep background check on the family court docket to confirm if David still held the legal authority to sign those papers. His arrogance blinded him to the most basic rule of legal due diligence. But the fraudulent custody document was only a fraction of Jamal's exposure. I pushed the folder aside and pulled up the digital ledger extracted from his firm's accounts. This was where Jamal transitioned from a sleazy family lawyer into a target for federal prosecution. By using his firm's trust account to mask the $500,000 Harrison paid to clear David's gambling debts, Jamal committed textbook money laundering. He intentionally commingled illicit extortion funds with legitimate client money to scrub the transaction clean. Furthermore, because Harrison and Caroline resided in Connecticut and David's bookies operated offshore routing, that money constituted a massive violation of the federal wire fraud statute. Jamal used interstate electronic communications to facilitate a coordinated scheme to defraud a mother of her child. The magnitude of his criminal liability was staggering. Jamal had literally jeopardized his entire legal career, his prestigious partnership, and his personal freedom just to play the role of the wealthy savior for Chelsea. He thought he was untouchable behind the polished mahogany doors of his corner office. He thought attorney-client privilege would cast an impenetrable cloak of invisibility over his dirty financial maneuvers. I opened a new highly encrypted directory on my laptop and began compiling the ultimate federal dossier. I did not format it like a standard family court complaint. I formatted it exactly like a racketeering and corrupt organization's indictment. I organized the evidence with surgical precision. I created a stark, undeniable timeline linking the threatening text messages from David's bookies to the exact minute the $500,000 hit Jamal's trust account. I attached the recovered emails where Jamal explicitly detailed his strategy to use my emotional distress to manipulate the local authorities. I highlighted the routing numbers proving the money had crossed state lines to finalize the purchase of my son. Every document timestamp and hidden text message was cross-referenced and cataloged. I was building a digital guillotine and making absolutely certain the blade was razor-sharp. Jamal essentially handed me the blueprint to his own destruction. If he had just stayed out of it, if my parents simply gave David the cash directly, it would have been a messy civil dispute regarding parental rights. But Jamal had to show off. He had to be the brilliant maestro orchestrating the perfect crime. By moving the money through his law firm across state boundaries to facilitate the illegal relocation of a minor, he elevated a domestic nightmare into a multi-agency federal investigation. I watched the final pieces of financial data transfer into the secure dossier. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen, but my mind operated with terrifying clarity. Jamal had grossly miscalculated the board. He thought he was playing chess against a grieving, defenseless mother. He did not realize he had just invited a federal investigator to audit his entire existence. I closed the ledgers and took a steady breath. The trap was fully set. The evidence of wire fraud and money laundering was locked, sealed, and ready for deployment. Now it was time to retrieve the absolute final piece of the puzzle. It was time to pull up the court order from 12 months ago. The single heavily guarded document that would completely nullify Jamal's fake custody papers and instantly turn my parents and my husband into federal kidnappers. I navigated past the public-facing records and entered the restricted portal for sealed family court rulings. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in my own name and David's. The search query took a few agonizing seconds to process. I stared at the loading progress bar, my mind flashing back to the exact events of 12 months ago. A year ago, David had made a catastrophic error in judgment, an incident entirely separate from his secret gambling addiction. He had been driving home late from a corporate networking event, distracted and speeding. He blew through a red light and caused a severe multi-vehicle collision. While no one was fatally injured, the other drivers suffered permanent life-altering injuries. David was found entirely at fault by the responding authorities. The victims hired aggressive personal injury lawyers who immediately filed a massive civil lawsuit against him. They were coming for absolutely everything he owned, seeking millions in punitive damages. David was terrified. He was looking at total financial ruin. His wages were going to be garnished, his physical assets seized, and his banking accounts frozen indefinitely. As his wife, I was desperate to shield our young son from the impending fallout. I knew that in brutal civil litigation, aggressive plaintiffs often attempt to target joint assets or leverage familial resources to force a rapid settlement. I could not let Leo's future, his college funds, and his physical stability become collateral damage in David's reckless mistake. I hired a private, highly discreet family attorney who suggested a radical but necessary protective measure. The attorney drafted a petition for the complete transfer of sole legal and physical custody exclusively to me. We framed it to the court as a voluntary relinquishment to protect the child from the impending financial and emotional distress of a drawn-out civil war. David was so paralyzed by the fear of losing everything that he signed the documents without a single moment of hesitation. He eagerly surrendered his parental rights just to create a legal firewall between his impending bankruptcy and my protected assets. A sympathetic family court judge reviewed our urgent petition, agreed with the protective strategy, and officially approved the transfer. The court order was finalized, stamped, and sealed deep within the county archives. David eventually managed to settle the civil lawsuit months later through a complex insurance payout and heavily leveraged debt, which ironically fueled his gambling relapse. But we never reversed the custody agreement. We simply never bothered to file the expensive, time-consuming paperwork to reinstate his parental rights. For the last 12 months, under the strict, uncompromising eyes of the law, David had been nothing more than a glorified roommate. He possessed absolute zero legal authority over my son. The search query on my laptop finally finished loading. A single encrypted PDF file appeared on the screen. It was the certified judge-signed decree of sole custody. I opened the document and stared at the glorious, irrefutable text. I possessed 100% legal and physical custody of Leo. David was legally a complete stranger to my child. This was the fatal, catastrophic flaw in Jamal's arrogant masterpiece. Jamal had looked at the original adoption certificate from 5 years ago and assumed the status quo had remained unchanged. Because Jamal was a high-powered corporate lawyer, accustomed to dealing with multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions, he treated this kidnapping exactly like a hostile corporate takeover. He looked at David as a primary shareholder whose signature was required to close the deal. Jamal completely failed to perform a basic background check on the local family court docket. He never once thought to verify if the man selling the child actually owned the legal rights to the child. By skipping that single fundamental step of due diligence, Jamal had unwittingly built his entire criminal conspiracy on a foundation of absolute vapor. The towering stack of intimidating legal documents he had shoved in my face, the ones containing David's bold blue signature, were entirely worthless. They carried the exact same legal weight as a napkin scribbled with crayon. David had absolutely no authority to grant my parents permission to take Leo. He had no authority to transfer custody to Chelsea. He had no right to even authorize Leo leaving the front porch. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face. The implications of this specific document elevated the situation from a horrific family betrayal into a federal catastrophe for everyone involved. When the local police officers stood in my living room earlier tonight, they operated under the assumption that a legal parent had consented to the child's relocation. That assumption made it a local civil dispute. But because David was not a legal parent, my parents had entered my property, forcefully removed a tracking device from a minor, and taken that minor across state lines to Chelsea's mansion without the explicit consent of the sole legal guardian. That is not a temporary family arrangement. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, transporting a minor across state lines without the legal guardian's consent is the exact, unarguable definition of federal kidnapping. My parents and my sister were no longer just toxic, entitled snobs trying to play house with my child. They were federal fugitives holding a kidnapped boy. And Jamal, the brilliant corporate attorney, was the primary conspirator who had facilitated a ransom payment across state lines to execute the abduction. I downloaded the certified custody order and dragged it directly into the center of my encrypted evidence folder. It sat perfectly alongside the wire fraud routing numbers and the horrifying group chat transcripts. The weapon was fully forged. Every single person who had conspired to steal my son had unknowingly walked straight into a federal penitentiary cell. They thought they had used their wealth and their shiny law degrees to outsmart me. They thought they could buy my flesh and blood and leave me crying in the dark. Instead, they had handed me the absolute power to destroy their entire existence. I closed the laptop, the satisfying click echoing in the sterile hotel room. It was time to make the call. It was time to unleash the federal government on my own family. I opened my eyes and immediately flipped the laptop screen back up. The harsh light flooded the dim hotel room once again. It was not enough to simply have the evidence sitting on a local desktop. If I walked into a federal building and handed them a disorganized pile of digital receipts, I would be treated like just another hysterical civilian in a domestic dispute. Bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace, and I did not have months to wait for a preliminary investigation. Every single second that Leo spent in Chelsea's sprawling New York estate was a second too long. I needed to hand the authorities a fully weaponized prosecution package that would force them to act immediately. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out a military-grade encrypted external hard drive. It was a matte black device I used for transporting sensitive corporate audit files. I plugged the drive into the USB port and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green light flashed, signaling the vault was ready. My hands flew across the keyboard with ruthless precision. I began constructing the master dossier, organizing the files exactly how a federal prosecutor would need them for a grand jury indictment. I created the primary folder and titled it Operation Checkmate. Into the first subfolder, I dragged the certified decree of sole custody. This single document transformed a local misunderstanding into a high-priority federal crisis. Connecticut law enforcement had dismissed my emergency call under the false assumption that David was a legal parent. With this court order proving David possessed zero legal authority, the narrative drastically shifted. My parents had entered my property, forcefully removed a tracking device from a minor, and transported that minor across state boundaries into New York without the consent of the sole legal guardian. Under the Federal Kidnapping Act, transporting an abducted child across state lines triggers automatic federal jurisdiction. I created a second subfolder labeled The Ransom. Here I deposited the digital wreckage of David's hidden life. I uploaded the recovered text messages from his offshore sports bookies, highlighting the violent threats demanding $500,000. I matched those threat logs perfectly, with the wire transfer receipts showing the exact moment the illegal syndicate was paid off. I laid out the financial timeline clearly. David was desperate, facing extreme physical and professional ruin. His vulnerability was the exact leverage my family exploited. The third subfolder was dedicated entirely to Jamal. I named it The Architect. My brother-in-law thought his corporate law degree made him invincible, assuming his firm's trust account would effectively mask the money trail. I dropped the packet sniffing data into the folder, exposing the routing history of the $500,000. The money moved from Harrison and Caroline's corporate holding account directly into Jamal's protected legal escrow, and then straight into David's shell company. By using a financial institution to wash extortion money across state lines to purchase a human being, Jamal committed egregious acts of wire fraud and money laundering. He weaponized the banking system to fund a federal kidnapping. I moved to the final subfolder titled The Conspiracy. Here, I dumped the undeniable proof of their premeditated malice. I uploaded the recovered iCloud emails where Harrison and Jamal openly negotiated the price of my son. I included the live group chat transcripts where Chelsea and Caroline mocked my grief and bragged about using a fabricated psychological evaluation to declare me unfit. These communications proved everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing. There was no innocent mistake. It was a highly coordinated criminal enterprise designed to traffic a child for personal gratification. With the raw evidence transferred, I opened a blank document to draft the executive summary. A federal agent needs the narrative delivered in a clean format. I summarized the entire criminal operation in exactly 2 pages. I detailed the motive, explicitly outlining Chelsea's infertility, her past driving under the influence convictions that barred her from legal adoption, and my parents' toxic obsession with giving their golden child whatever she desired. I explained the financial bribery, the fraudulent custody paperwork Jamal drafted, and the crossing of state lines. I stripped all emotion from my writing. I used cold clinical forensic terminology. When the executive summary was complete, I dragged it into the root directory of the hard drive. I initiated the final encryption sequence. The laptop fan whirred loudly as the software locked the files behind strict security protocols. A notification popped up confirming the transfer was 100% successful. I safely ejected the heavy black drive and pulled it from the USB port. The device felt cold and solid in my palm. Holding it, I felt a powerful surge of adrenaline wash away the lingering exhaustion of the night. This small piece of hardware held the absolute destruction of my entire biological family. It held David's prison sentence. It held Jamal's disbarment and federal indictment. It held the financial ruin of my parents, and it held the key to bringing my son back home. I packed the laptop away and slipped the encrypted drive securely into the inner pocket of my jacket. I walked over to the hotel window and pulled the heavy blackout curtains aside. The morning sun was breaking over the horizon, casting bright light across the city skyline. A new day had arrived. I knew exactly who I needed to contact. Standard police detectives were completely useless to me now. I needed someone with the federal authority to raid a sprawling New York estate and freeze high-yield corporate trust accounts simultaneously. I pulled out my cell phone and navigated to my secure contacts list. I scrolled down until I found the direct number for Agent Reyes, a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whom I had collaborated with on a corporate embezzlement case. Agent Reyes knew my work. He knew I never exaggerated, and he knew that if I brought him a financial ledger, it was absolutely bulletproof. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear, listening to the steady tone as it rang. The trap was fully loaded, the evidence was airtight, and I was ready to pull the trigger. Reyes picked up on the second ring. "Clara," he answered, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly cut through the static of the line. "It is barely dawn. Tell me you are not calling to report a discrepancy in the pending pharmaceutical audit." "I need to see you right now," I said, keeping my tone entirely flat and professional. "Not at the field office. Somewhere quiet." I have a situation involving interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, and federal kidnapping. The silence on the other end was absolute. Agent Reyes was a seasoned veteran who had seen the absolute worst of white-collar crime, but the word kidnapping explicitly alters the temperature of any conversation. He knew I was a forensic accountant who dealt exclusively in verifiable facts. I did not exaggerate, and I certainly did not use federal buzzwords lightly. 49th Street Diner, Reyes replied without missing a single beat. Give me 20 minutes. I ended the call, grabbed my keys, and left the hotel room. The drive into the city was a blur of gray concrete and morning fog. I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown diner just as the sun fully breached the skyline. The establishment was mostly empty, occupied only by a few tired truck drivers and a waitress pouring black coffee behind a greasy counter. I slid into a booth in the far back corner facing the entrance, keeping my back to the wall. Exactly 10 minutes later, Agent Reyes walked through the double-glass doors. He was a tall, sharp-featured man wearing a dark trench coat over a plain suit. His keen eyes scanned the room, immediately locking onto my booth. He slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from me, signaling the waitress away with a quick, dismissive wave of his hand. He looked at my rumpled work clothes, my tense posture, and the dark circles sitting heavily under my eyes. "You look like you have been to hell and back, Clara," he stated, folding his hands on the sticky formica table. "Talk to me. Who was taken?" "My son." I replied, my voice devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "My 6-year-old legally adopted son, Leo." Reyes stiffened, his professional demeanor instantly shifting into high alert. "If this is a domestic custody dispute, Clara, my hands are tied. You know local law enforcement has strict jurisdiction over family matters. We cannot intervene unless federal lines are crossed." I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and placed the heavy, matte black external hard drive squarely in the center of the table. "I know the jurisdictional boundaries perfectly," I said, sliding the encrypted drive an inch toward him. "That is exactly why I did not call local dispatch again. This is not a custody dispute. This is a highly coordinated federal crime ring operating under the guise of family law." Reyes stared at the drive. "Walk me through the layout." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Last night, my parents forcefully removed my son's GPS tracking bracelet and transported him across state lines to my sister's estate in New York. They achieved this by paying off $500,000 of my husband's illegal offshore gambling debt. My husband signed a fraudulent custody transfer drafted by my brother-in-law Jamal, a senior partner at a major corporate law firm." Reyes narrowed his eyes. "If your husband signed a custody transfer, the locals will not touch it." He gave consent. "My husband lost his legal parental rights 12 months ago during a civil litigation protection maneuver," I countered, my voice slicing through the ambient diner noise. "I possess sole legal and physical custody. My husband's signature is legally void. My brother-in-law never checked the family court docket to verify the rights." Reyes leaned back slowly, the massive gravity of the situation washing over him. "So they moved a minor across state lines without the sole guardian's consent." "Exactly," I nodded. "But it gets much worse. My brother-in-law washed the $500,000 ransom through his law firm's legal trust account before wiring it to my husband's shell company. The money was then instantly routed to offshore syndicates in Macau and the Cayman Islands. It is textbook wire fraud and money laundering utilized to execute a federal kidnapping. I have the entire digital paper trail locked on that drive." Reyes did not ask any more questions. He pulled a highly secured tactical laptop from his briefcase, booted it up, and connected my encrypted drive. I typed my passcode sequence into his keyboard, unlocking the master dossier I had built hours ago. He opened the executive summary first. I sat completely still, watching his eyes dart across the glowing screen. I saw his jaw tighten as he reviewed the certified sole custody decree. I watched his eyebrows raise as he verified the timeline, matching the threatening text messages from the loan sharks to the massive wire transfer scrubbed through Jamal's firm. Finally, Reyes opened the recovered group chat transcripts. He read the messages where my family mocked my grief and openly discussed framing me as mentally unfit to secure their hostile takeover of my child. When he finished reading the vile messages, he closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. Clara Reyes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You handed me a fully wrapped federal indictment. This is a slam-dunk racketeering and corruption case mixed with child abduction. Your brother-in-law is looking at decades in federal prison, and your parents just bought themselves matching jumpsuits. I need my son back, I stated, gripping the edge of the table so hard my fingers ached. Every minute he is in that house, he is terrified. I know, Reyes replied, pulling out his secure federal communication device. We are opening a covert investigation right this second. I am mobilizing a rapid response task force from the field office. We have the Financial Crimes Division and the Child Exploitation Unit jumping on this immediately. But we have to play this incredibly smart. Why can we not just kick their door down right now? I demanded, a flash of maternal panic finally breaking through my icy exterior. You have the absolute proof. Because Jamal is a powerful attorney with deep pockets and aggressive political connections. Reyes explained, leaning forward to ensure total privacy. If we raid that New York estate without absolute ironclad operational security, he will tie us up in injunctions, claim the money was a legitimate legal retainer, and drag this out for months. We need to catch them actively confessing to the extortion and the illegal transfer of funds. We need them on a hot mic, dead to rights, completely unaware that the walls are closing in on them. Reyes looked at me intensely, his dark eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation or weakness. I need you to do exactly what they expect you to do. I need you to play the broken, defeated mother. Can you walk into the lion's den and get them to admit to the financial transaction on tape? I stared at the federal agent. The image of my mother's handwritten note flashed in my mind. The memory of my husband drinking bourbon after selling our child fueled the inferno burning in my chest. I did not just want my son back. I wanted to watch their entire arrogant empire burn to absolute ashes. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, I said, my voice completely devoid of fear. I will get you your confession. Reyes nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. He signaled to a black, unmarked van parked across the street from the diner. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in the back of a mobile command center, surrounded by digital surveillance equipment and 3 federal technicians. A female agent helped me thread a highly sophisticated recording device beneath my blouse. It was a microscopic wire completely undetectable to the naked eye, feeding a live audio stream directly back to the federal task force. We need them to explicitly state the terms of the financial transaction, Reyes instructed as he checked the audio levels on his monitor. We need your father or your husband to admit that $500,000 was exchanged for the physical custody of the boy. Your brother-in-law must confirm his involvement in masking the funds. Do not push them too hard. Let their own monumental arrogance do the heavy lifting. They already think they have beaten you. Let them gloat. I buttoned my blazer, feeling the cold, hard weight of the transmitter against my skin. It was time to bait the trap. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened a text message thread with my mother. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to channel the exact persona they expected to see. I had to become the helpless, panicked woman David had described to the police. I had to swallow every ounce of my pride. I typed slowly. Mom, please, I am begging you. The police will not help me, and David drained my personal accounts. I do not have the money to fight Jamal in court. I just want to see my son. Please let me see Leo. I will do whatever you want. I surrender. Let us just talk. I hit send and stared at the screen. The wait was agonizing. My heart hammered against my ribs as the delivery notification appeared. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. In the cramped surveillance van, Reyes watched my screen mirrored on his monitor. He held up a hand signaling me to remain perfectly still. Finally, 3 gray dots appeared on the screen. My mother was typing. The message that flashed across my display was dripping with absolute sickening triumph. Caroline wrote, I am glad you are finally acting like a rational adult, Clara. David told us you left the house. Chelsea and Jamal are hosting a small private gathering at their estate tonight to formally welcome Leo into his new permanent home. If you can behave yourself and act civilized, you may attend. We will discuss the final legal arrangements in Jamal's study away from the guests. Do not make a scene or you will never see the boy again. Reyes let out a low whistle. They are throwing a welcome party for a kidnapped child. The sheer audacity is staggering. I gripped my phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. They thought they were inviting a defeated, broken woman to sign away her life. I looked up at the federal agents surrounding me. "I am in," I said. The drive to upstate New York took just over an hour, but every passing mile felt like wading through thick mud. Agent Reyes trailed me at a safe distance in an unmarked vehicle, quietly coordinating with the federal tactical units positioning themselves around the perimeter of the sprawling neighborhood. As I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of Chelsea and Jamal's estate, a private security guard checked my name off a pristine clipboard. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, revealing a meticulously manicured driveway lined with imported luxury vehicles. Mercedes sedans, Bentleys, and custom Porsches gleamed under the soft ambient glow of the expensive landscape lighting. This was the massive fortress of wealth and privilege my parents believed made them absolutely invincible. I handed my keys to a valet dressed in a crisp uniform, adjusted the collar of my blazer to ensure the federal wire was perfectly concealed against my skin, and walked up the sweeping stone steps to the towering double oak doors. The sheer suffocating opulence of the house hit me the exact second I crossed the threshold. The grand foyer featured a dual sweeping staircase and a massive crystal chandelier that cast a golden, overwhelming light over the massive crowd. A live string quartet played classical music in the corner, providing an elegant high society soundtrack to what was essentially a human trafficking celebration. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the region's absolute elite. I recognized local politicians, prominent corporate executives, and even a few family court judges mingling freely near the towering champagne fountain. Jamal, the slick African-American corporate attorney who orchestrated this entire nightmare, was working the room flawlessly. He stood there in his custom-tailored evening wear, clinking crystal glasses and offering warm smiles to the powerful connections he constantly bragged about holding in his pocket. They all offered him warm congratulations, completely oblivious to the fact that they were actively drinking champagne inside a federal crime scene. I moved through the crowded room like an invisible ghost. A few wealthy guests threw me dismissive, pitying glances. I knew exactly what narrative my mother had spun to her elite friends. To them, I was the tragic, mentally unstable older sister who simply could not handle the intense pressures of working-class motherhood, graciously allowing the wealthy, capable Blackwell family to step in and rescue the child. I kept my face entirely blank, strictly maintaining the facade of a broken, compliant, and defeated woman. Near the enormous stone fireplace, I spotted my parents holding court with a group of wealthy investors. Harrison was laughing loudly, his chest puffed out with absolute triumph. Caroline stood right beside him, draped in heavy diamonds, eagerly accepting compliments on her latest philanthropic endeavor. Not too far away, my husband David stood nervously near the wet bar. He was nursing a heavy glass of scotch, looking slightly jittery, but otherwise playing the role of the supportive family member to absolute perfection. None of them possessed a single fleeting shred of guilt. Then the crowd parted slightly, and my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. Standing in the dead center of the formal dining room was Chelsea. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald gown, radiating the arrogant glow of a woman who had just purchased her ultimate, highly coveted accessory. And standing right beside her, clutching the heavy fabric of her dress with white knuckles, was my son. My breath caught sharply in my throat. They had dressed Leo in a stiff, incredibly expensive miniature tuxedo that looked entirely uncomfortable on his small frame. His usually messy, playful hair was slicked back harshly with heavy gel. His bright, energetic eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked completely overwhelmed by the loud music, the towering strangers, and the suffocating, possessive grip Chelsea kept on his small shoulder. She was proudly parading him around the room, introducing him to local socialites, as her brand-new son completely ignoring the silent, screaming panic radiating from his trembling little body. I took a step forward, completely abandoning any pretense of blending into the background. I moved swiftly through the thick crowd, my eyes locked entirely on my little boy. Leo saw me. The absolute fear on his face instantly shattered. "Mommy!" he screamed, his high voice slicing through the polite chatter of the high society guests. He ripped himself out of Chelsea's possessive grasp and bolted across the polished marble floor. I dropped to my knees right in the middle of the grand foyer, throwing my arms open wide. Leo crashed hard into my chest, burying his face into my neck, sobbing uncontrollably. His tiny hands grabbed fistfuls of my blazer, holding on with a desperate, terrified strength. I wrapped my arms around him, crushing him to my body, burying my face in his slicked back hair. He smelled like expensive, heavy cologne they had sprayed on him, completely masking his usual sweet scent of Play-Doh and outside air. "I have got you, baby," I whispered fiercely into his ear, completely ignoring the sudden heavy silence that fell over the surrounding guests. "Mommy is right here. I am never letting you go again." The emotional reunion lasted exactly 5 seconds. A heavy, punishing hand clamped down on my shoulder with bruising, aggressive force. I looked up. My father Harrison towered over me, his face dark red with suppressed violent rage. Behind him, Jamal stepped forward, his eyes completely devoid of warmth, despite the charming, apologetic smile he shot to the staring guests. "Just a little separation anxiety," Jamal announced smoothly, his deep, authoritative voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "It is a very emotional transition for the child. We are going to handle this privately. Please everyone enjoy the champagne." Harrison's grip on my shoulder tightened until I gasped in genuine pain. He forcefully hauled me to my feet, nearly dragging Leo up with me. "Let go of him right now," Clara Harrison ordered in a vicious, guttural whisper meant only for my ears and the hidden microphone. "Do not embarrass us in front of these judges. You agreed to come here and finalize this quietly." I clutched Leo tighter to my chest. "He is my son," I said, maintaining the panicked, defeated tone Agent Reyes needed for the federal recording. "We are leaving right now." Harrison forcefully shoved himself between me and the grand entrance, completely blocking my only path to the front doors. His massive frame formed an impenetrable physical barricade. "You are not going anywhere," he hissed. "You are going to walk quietly into Jamal's study. You are going to sign the non-disclosure agreements, and you are going to walk out of this house alone. If you try to run with that boy, I will have Jamal signal the police chief, standing in the kitchen, and we will have you arrested for trespassing and child endangerment before you even reach the driveway." Chelsea strutted over her emerald gown, swishing aggressively against the marble. She reached out and forcefully pried Leo's desperate hands off my jacket. "Stop being so dramatic, Clara," Chelsea snapped, dragging a crying Leo back to her side. "You lost. Accept it gracefully for once in your pathetic life." David finally appeared, lingering cowardly behind my father. "Just do what they say," Clara David muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. "It is already done." I looked at the 5 of them surrounding me, forming a suffocating wall of wealth and intimidation. They were physically trapping me in the house, actively threatening me with arrest, and forcefully separating me from my crying son. They felt absolutely invincible. They had no idea they were speaking directly into a federal microphone. I let my shoulders slump. I forced a defeated sob from my throat, playing the broken woman perfectly. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my head bowed. "Let us go to the study. Let us finish this." Jamal smiled a cold, predatory smirk. "Right this way, Clara. Let us talk business." Jamal turned on his heel and led the way down a long, vaulted corridor, away from the glittering chandelier and the polite chatter of the high society guests. Chelsea followed immediately behind him, but not before forcefully shoving a sobbing Leo into the arms of a waiting uniformed nanny. She barked a sharp order to take the boy up to the newly decorated nursery and lock the door. I watched my son reach his small hands out for me as he was dragged up the grand staircase. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood just to keep myself from breaking cover. I kept my head down, my shoulders hunched, completely selling the image of a thoroughly beaten woman. We reached the end of the hallway. Jamal pushed open a set of massive, heavy oak doors and ushered us inside his private study. Harrison, Caroline, and David filed in closely behind me, acting like prison guards, ensuring the inmate did not make a sudden run for the perimeter. As soon as the last person crossed the threshold, Jamal closed the heavy oak doors. The thick mechanical click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. Instantly, the ambient noise of the lavish party outside vanished completely. The room was heavily soundproofed, designed for highly confidential legal and political negotiations. It featured dark mahogany-paneled walls, towering bookshelves, and thick Persian carpets that swallowed the sound of our footsteps. Jamal walked straight over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table and casually poured himself a generous measure of expensive bourbon. Harrison bypassed the guest chairs entirely and took a seat directly behind Jamal's massive executive desk, positioning himself as the ultimate authority figure in the room. Caroline and Chelsea stood together near the marble fireplace, their arms crossed identically, wearing matching expressions of supreme aristocratic disdain. David simply slunk into the darkest corner of the library, staring at the floor patterns, too cowardly to even look at the woman he had just destroyed. I stood alone in the absolute center of the room. I let my breathing become ragged and shallow. I forced my hands to tremble visibly. Every single person in this room believed they were looking at a pathetic, outmaneuvered victim. They had absolutely no idea they were standing in front of a live federal microphone. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. I pitched my voice perfectly, injecting it with exactly the right amount of desperation and despair to ensure the audio receiver taped beneath my blouse caught every single tremor. "How can you just take him away from me? I am his mother. I have loved him and cared for him every single day since he was a baby." Caroline rolled her eyes and let out a harsh, bitter sigh. "Oh, stop the amateur dramatics, Clara. We are behind closed doors now. You do not need to put on a pathetic performance for us. You are barely a mother. You are obsessed with your accounting firm, working ungodly hours, leaving that poor boy with babysitters half the week. Chelsea has the time, the resources, and the maternal instinct to give him the life he actually deserves. She cannot just claim my child because she has a bigger house." I cried out, stepping closer to the desk where my father sat. I looked directly at Harrison. "You cannot just steal a human being, Dad. It is a crime. You cannot just buy a child." Harrison slammed his heavy hand down onto the mahogany desk. The sudden violent noise made David flinch in the corner. "Listen to me very closely, you ungrateful little brat," Harrison snarled, dropping any remaining pretense of civility. "I paid $500,000 to clean up your husband's mess. You have nothing. Leo is ours now." I mentally checked the first box on Agent Reyes's list. Harrison had just confessed to the financial transaction and the motive on a live federal wire. I turned my tear-filled eyes toward the dark corner of the room. "David," I whimpered, letting a sob break my voice. "Tell them they cannot do this. You sold our son to pay off your bookies. How could you let them bribe you?" David finally looked up. His face twisted in a pathetic mixture of shame and defensive anger. "It was $500,000, Clara. Do you have any concept of what those men were going to do to me? They were going to show up at my firm. They were going to break my legs. I was drowning. Your father offered me a clean slate and a senior executive position. Jamal said he could make it entirely legal. I had to sign the custody transfer papers. I had no other choice to save my life." Checkmate number 2. David just admitted to receiving the massive extortion payment in direct exchange for executing the fraudulent custody transfer. I wiped my eyes with the back of my trembling hand, pivoting my attention to the most dangerous person in the room. I looked at Jamal, who was swirling his bourbon and watching me with absolute predatory amusement. "You are lying," I said to Jamal, pointing an accusatory finger at his custom suit. I let my voice sound frantic, bordering on completely hysterical. "You are a lawyer, Jamal. You know the banking laws. My father could never move $500,000 of clean corporate money into David's dirty shell accounts to pay off offshore loan sharks. The Internal Revenue Service flags any wire transfer over $10,000. You are just trying to terrify me with fake numbers. The federal government would have audited your accounts the very next morning. You are bluffing. I threw the bait directly at his massive, fragile ego. I challenged his intelligence. I told a brilliant, narcissistic corporate attorney that he was not smart enough to pull off a financial crime. It was the absolute ultimate insult. Jamal let out a deep, booming laugh. He set his bourbon glass down and walked slowly toward me, stopping just inches from my face. He looked down at me with an expression of supreme, untouchable arrogance. You really are just a simple blue-collar number cruncher, aren't you? Clara. Jamal mocked, his deep voice resonating perfectly into the hidden microphone resting against my collarbone. You think you understand high-level finance because you audit mid-sized business accounts. You have absolutely no idea how the real world operates. Your father did not wire a single penny directly to David. That would be incredibly stupid. Harrison wired the $500,000 directly into my law firm's primary legal trust account. Jamal smirked, clearly thoroughly enjoying the sound of his own voice. He was practically giving a masterclass on federal money laundering. I filed the deposit under a fabricated corporate retainer agreement, Jamal continued, boasting with total confidence. Attorney-client privilege protects that specific trust account from standard financial audits. Once the money was completely washed and sitting safely inside my protected legal escrow, I authorized a clean, untraceable wire transfer directly into David's private holding company. He then paid off his associates in Macau. The money is a complete ghost. You could hire the best family lawyers in the entire state of New York, and they would never find a single shred of financial evidence linking your father to your husband. I completely erased the transaction. I kept my head bowed. I kept my shoulders trembling. I let out one final soft, defeated sob. But behind the curtain of my falling hair, my eyes were completely dry, and my mind was singing with absolute vicious victory. Jamal had just explicitly detailed his direct role in interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, and federal extortion. He had mapped out the entire criminal conspiracy from start to finish on a live federal broadcast. Agent Reyes and his tactical team, sitting in the surveillance van down the street, had just recorded every single word. The trap had snapped completely shut. They had given me everything I needed. Well, Harrison said, leaning back in the heavy leather chair and steepling his fingers together. Now that you finally understand exactly how outmatched you are, it is time for us to conclude this unpleasant business. Harrison reached into the breast pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a gold fountain pen. He quickly scrawled a series of numbers across a fresh check, ripped it from the binding with a sharp tear, and slammed it down onto the desk in front of me. I stared down at the crisp rectangle of paper resting on the polished mahogany wood. The ink was still wet, glistening under the harsh glow of the library desk lamp. $100,000. A clean six-figure sum, written out in my father's aggressive, sharp handwriting. Next to the check sat a thick, legally binding non-disclosure agreement undoubtedly prepared by Jamal hours in advance. It was neatly bound with a heavy brass paperclip waiting for my signature. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands over his stomach with the deep, comfortable satisfaction of a man who just purchased the world. "Take it," Harrison commanded. His voice was no longer angry. It was dripping with the sickening, patronizing tone of a corporate executive finalizing a hostile takeover. "Sign the NDA. Walk away and start over. You are a smart girl, Clara. Do not fight a war you have already lost." Caroline stepped away from the fireplace and moved to stand right beside him, placing her manicured hand on his shoulder to present a united, impenetrable front. "It is a very generous offer, Clara," my mother added, her tone utterly devoid of any maternal warmth. "With that money, you can finally pay off your mortgage. You can take a long vacation. You can find a nice, quiet man and have a biological child of your own. Leo is already upstairs, safe and happy. He will have the best schools, the best tutors, and a trust fund waiting for him. Do not be selfish. Take the money and leave gracefully." Chelsea let out a soft, mocking laugh from her position across the room. "Just take the check, Clara. It is more money than you make in a year grinding away at that depressing accounting firm. You could actually buy some decent clothes for a change. I kept my head bowed for a long, agonizing moment. I let the silence stretch and expand, filling every single corner of the soundproofed library. I listened to the heavy, steady thud of my own heartbeat. I listened to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the 5 people who had conspired to sell my son. They were all waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to reach out with trembling hands, take the money, and admit absolute, undeniable defeat. Instead, I reached up and slowly wiped the moisture from my cheeks. I pressed my fingertips against my eyelids, clearing away the manufactured tears. I let out a long, slow breath. The ragged, panicked edge that had characterized my voice for the last hour completely evaporated. I dropped my hands to my sides. I rolled my shoulders back, the fabric of my blazer shifting slightly against the hidden federal wire taped securely to my chest. I slowly raised my head and locked my eyes directly onto Harrison's. The performance was officially over. The air in the room seemed to undergo an instantaneous, violent shift in barometric pressure. The temperature plummeted to absolute zero. The heavy, suffocating aura of my supposed grief vanished, replaced by a terrifying, suffocating stillness. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not blink. I just stared at my father with the cold, dead eyes of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. The sudden, jarring transformation in my physical demeanor sent a visible shockwave through the room. Harrison's smug, self-satisfied smile completely vanished, replaced by a deep furrow of confusion. Caroline's hand tightened rigidly on his shoulder. Chelsea stopped laughing, her emerald green gown suddenly still against the marble floor. In the dark corner of the room, David took a sudden nervous step backward, his back hitting the bookshelf with a soft thud. He knew my expressions better than anyone else in the room, and he recognized the exact look on my face. It was the look I got when I caught a corrupt executive lying on a federal tax return. Only Jamal seemed to understand that the dynamic had shifted, though his massive ego prevented him from realizing exactly how dangerous the situation had become. He narrowed his eyes, setting his empty bourbon glass down on the side table. "Sign the paper," Clara, Jamal ordered, his deep voice carrying a sudden, sharp edge of warning. "Do not overthink this. You have absolutely zero leverage here. We hold all the cards. We have the legal documents, we have the boy, and we have the financial resources to bury you under decades of litigation. Sign the NDA, take your father's money, and walk out the front door." I ignored Jamal completely. I kept my gaze deadlocked on Harrison. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. The paper felt remarkably flimsy in my fingers. I held it up to the light, examining it as if it were a fascinating, slightly disgusting biological specimen. $100,000, I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was smooth, conversational, and completely devoid of fear. The calm, icy resonance of my words made Caroline physically flinch. "You priced your own grandson at exactly $100,000. Plus the $500,000 you used to bail out my cowardly husband, of course. That makes $600,000 total. A rather steep price for a stolen child, do you not agree?" Harrison slammed his fist on the desk again, attempting to regain control of the room through sheer intimidation. "Watch your tone with me," he barked. "You are in no position to be making sarcastic remarks. I am giving you a lifeline because your mother begged me to be lenient. I could have easily thrown you out into the street with absolutely nothing. You will take that money, you will sign that non-disclosure agreement, and you will surrender your rights today." I lowered the check and slowly turned my head to look at David. He was sweating again. His earlier confidence had completely dissolved the second I stopped crying. He looked like a cornered animal frantically searching for an exit that did not exist. "And you, David," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You sold the boy who called you dad just so you would not have to face the consequences of your own pathetic, degenerate gambling addiction. You let these people treat our son like a piece of collateral to balance your illegal ledgers. You let my sister lock him in a room upstairs while he screamed for me." David swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "Clara, just listen to them. Please, just sign the papers. It is better this way, for everyone." I turned my attention back to the check resting between my fingers. The signature was bold. The routing numbers were clearly printed at the bottom. It was a tangible, physical piece of evidence confirming a payout. It was the cherry on top of the massive federal case, sitting safely on Agent Reyes's laptop in the surveillance van down the street. They had given me the motive, the illegal wire transfer details, the digital confession, and now the actual hush money to cover up the crime. "You are right about one thing, Dad," I said, breaking the heavy silence. "I am a very smart girl. In fact, I am an exceptionally brilliant forensic accountant. I spend 60 hours a week destroying arrogant, wealthy men who genuinely believe their money makes them completely invincible. Men who think they can hide their crimes behind slick lawyers and fake paperwork." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance to the heavy mahogany desk. I held the check out in front of me, grasping the crisp edges between my thumbs and forefingers. The room was so quiet that the faint rustle of the paper sounded like a roaring fire. I looked at Jamal, then at Chelsea, then at my mother, and finally back to my father. "You all thought you were playing a game of family court chess?" I said, a dark, victorious smile finally breaking across my face. "You thought you could bend the rules because you hold the power in this family. But you forgot the most important rule of the game." I tightened my grip on the check. The atmosphere in the library plummeted far below freezing. You never ever play a high-stakes game without running a background check on the board. With a swift and fluid motion, I tore the $100,000 check straight down the middle. Harrison gasped loudly, his eyes wide with absolute shock. I placed the two halves together and tore them again, then again, reducing his ultimate bribe into a handful of worthless confetti. I let my hand fall open, allowing the shredded pieces to flutter down like snow onto the pristine surface of Jamal's mahogany desk. Caroline let out a sharp gasp, taking a panicked step back, as if the falling paper were physically dangerous. Chelsea's jaw dropped in sheer disbelief. David pressed himself completely flat against the bookshelves in his dark corner, realizing exactly what my brazen defiance meant. But I was not finished. I reached into the side pocket of my heavy duffel bag resting by my feet. My fingers brushed the cold, hard edges of a sealed manila envelope. I pulled it out and slammed it down directly on top of the shredded check. The sharp, cracking sound echoed violently off the soundproofed library walls. I looked directly at my arrogant brother-in-law. Jamal was staring at the envelope, his confident smirk finally faltering into something resembling genuine apprehension. "Read it," I commanded. My voice left absolutely zero room for debate. Jamal hesitated for a fraction of a second before his massive ego propelled him forward. He reached across the desk, broke the wax seal, and pulled out the thick stack of papers. The document was bound with a heavy blue ribbon and bore the unmistakable raised golden seal of a state family court judge. I watched his dark eyes scan the first page. I watched the exact moment his towering, impenetrable arrogance completely shattered. The color drained from his face at an alarming speed, leaving his skin looking ashen and terrified. His hands, which had been so steady pouring expensive bourbon just minutes ago, began to shake violently. The heavy parchment paper rattled uncontrollably in his grip. "What is it?" Harrison demanded, leaning aggressively over the desk to see. "Jamal, what does it say?" Jamal could not speak. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. He just stared at the legal decree as if he were holding a live explosive. "I will save him the trouble of translating legal jargon," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Jamal. "You are a brilliant lawyer, Jamal. You know exactly how to mask a massive wire transfer and launder extortion money through your firm's private trust accounts. But you forgot to check the family court docket. You assumed David was a legal parent because you looked at a 5-year-old adoption certificate." I took a slow step closer to the desk, ensuring the hidden federal microphone taped to my chest picked up every single syllable. "David has had zero legal rights to Leo for 12 months. Last year, to protect our assets during his massive civil lawsuit, he voluntarily signed a court-approved petition granting me sole legal and physical custody. I am the only legally recognized parent of that boy. David's signature on your ironclad contract is not worth the paper it is printed on." The library immediately descended into absolute suffocating chaos. Chelsea shrieked violently, snatching the papers directly from Jamal's trembling hands. Harrison's face turned a terrifying shade of purple as he read the undeniable truth over her shoulder. "This is a mistake," Jamal finally stammered, his deep, authoritative voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. He backed away from the mahogany desk, bumping roughly into Caroline. "This cannot be right. I checked the primary registry." "You checked the standard public records," I corrected coldly. "You did not check the sealed financial protection dockets. You built an entire criminal conspiracy on the signature of a man who has absolutely no legal authority to authorize anything." The horrific realization slammed into the room with the punishing force of a wrecking ball. They had not executed a clever family court arrangement. They had just committed a massive, undeniable federal crime. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the soundproofed library was the ragged, panicked breathing of the 5 people who had just realized their entire existence was over. I stood perfectly still, watching the profound structural collapse of their arrogant empire. Harrison gripped the thick edge of the mahogany desk. His knuckles turned stark white and his chest heaved as his brain struggled to process the magnitude of his catastrophic error. Caroline covered her mouth with both trembling hands. Her heavy diamond rings caught the harsh light of the desk lamp as a stifled, pathetic whimper escaped her throat. Chelsea completely lost her mind. She lunged forward, snatched the certified custody order off the desk, threw it onto the floor, and stomped on it with her designer heel. "This is fake," Chelsea shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the towering bookshelves. "She is lying, Jamal. Tell me she is lying right now. This is just another one of her pathetic, jealous attempts to ruin my perfect life. She fabricated this document because she wants to steal my child." Jamal did not answer his hysterical wife. He could not even bring himself to look at her. The brilliant corporate attorney was staring blankly at his own trembling hands, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that his prestigious legal career had just evaporated. He knew exactly what that gold state seal meant. He knew the document was entirely authentic, and he knew he had failed to do the most basic background check. I took another measured step forward, closing the distance, ensuring my voice remained crystal clear for the federal wire taped securely to my chest. "It is not fake, Chelsea," I said, my tone as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel. "And you are no longer a wealthy socialite hosting a lavish welcome party for your new son. You are a federal criminal currently harboring an abducted child across state lines." Harrison abruptly lunged forward, slamming his heavy fist down on the leather blotter. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face, trying to summon the imposing patriarch persona he had used to control me my entire life. "You listen to me!" Harrison roared, his face contorted in sheer desperation and blind rage. "I have the best defense attorneys in the entire country on retainer. I have golfed with half the appellate judges in this state. You think some obscure family court document is going to stop me? I will bury you in litigation until you are living on the street. I will drag your name through the mud until you voluntarily hand that boy over to us, just to stop the bleeding." I tilted my head, watching my father throw empty, pathetic threats into the void. "You cannot bribe your way out of a federal indictment." "Dad," I replied coldly, "and you certainly cannot intimidate the United States Department of Justice." The sudden mention of the federal government made David let out a strangled, terrified gasp from his dark corner. He finally understood exactly what kind of trap he had walked into. "Let us review the exact federal statutes you all just gleefully violated on a live audio recording," I announced, stepping right into the center of their panicked circle. My voice carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. I pointed directly at my father. "Harrison, by coordinating a $500,000 payment to coerce a man who has zero legal parental rights into signing fraudulent custody documents, you committed felony extortion and bribery. By forcing the removal of a minor child's tracking device and transporting that child across state borders without the sole legal guardian's explicit consent, you violated the Federal Kidnapping Act. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence that guarantees you will die inside a federal penitentiary." Harrison staggered back as if he had been physically struck. He dropped heavily into the leather executive chair, all the color draining from his face. I pivoted my piercing gaze to Jamal. The slick attorney was sweating profusely, frantically loosening his expensive silk tie as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "And you, Jamal," I continued mercilessly, "you are the true mastermind of this spectacular disaster. You orchestrated a massive wire fraud conspiracy by moving Harrison's extortion money across state lines to pay off an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. To mask the transaction, you ran the dirty cash directly through your prestigious law firm's client trust accounts. That is textbook, undeniable money laundering. The federal government is going to seize every single asset you own, freeze your firm's accounts by dawn, and permanently revoke your license to practice law before you even see the inside of a jail cell." Jamal let out a pathetic, whimpering groan. He collapsed into one of the velvet guest chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands. The invincible lawyer had been completely broken in under 2 minutes. Finally, I turned to the darkest corner of the library. David was hyperventilating, his chest heaving wildly beneath his tailored suit. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "David," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You sold my son. You used my innocent, beautiful boy as a bargaining chip to save your own kneecaps from violent bookies. You signed fraudulent documents and tried to convince the local authorities that I was a mentally unstable, unfit mother. You are going to federal prison for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and the illegal gambling syndicate you owe money to will likely be waiting for you inside." "No," David screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. "Clara, please, I did not want to do it. They forced me. They threatened to ruin my career. You have to believe me. I can fix this. I can withdraw my signature. I can testify against them in court. I will give you anything you want. There is nothing left to fix," I stated, staring at the pathetic, cowardly man I once called my husband. "You are entirely useless to me now." The room descended into a chaotic, deafening panic. Caroline collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk and pleading for mercy. Chelsea screamed at the top of her lungs, throwing a heavy crystal paperweight across the room. It smashed against the far wall, raining sharp shards of glass down onto the expensive carpet. Harrison clutched his chest, gasping for air, as his entire empire crumbled around him. "We have to get out of here," David shouted, absolute panic taking over his body. He scrambled away from the bookshelves, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors. Jamal unlocked the doors. "We have to leave right now. We have to get to an airport before they close the borders." David lunged past me, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically against the Persian rug as he made a desperate, cowardly run for the exit. He grabbed the heavy brass handle of the library door, violently twisting it, trying to throw the deadbolt open. Chelsea pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face, her voice completely hoarse from screaming. "You are lying!" Chelsea shrieked, tears completely ruining her perfect makeup. "You are making all of this up to scare us. You do not have the FBI listening. You are just a pathetic, jealous liar who wants to ruin my perfect night." I did not flinch. I did not back away from her unhinged fury. I simply stood my ground in the center of the lavish, soundproofed room. I slowly raised my left arm and calmly looked down at my watch. The metallic ticking of the second hand felt loud and precise in the chaotic, echoing library. I looked up, meeting my sister's frantic, terrified eyes with a gaze of absolute ice. "I did not come here to negotiate," I stated, my voice slicing effortlessly through the noise. "I came here to keep you in this room until they arrived." The heavy oak doors of the library did not just open, they exploded inward with a deafening, violent crash. David, who had his hands frantically tearing at the brass handles just a fraction of a second before, was thrown violently backward by the massive kinetic force. He hit the Persian rug hard, scrambling backward like a terrified insect. Before anyone inside the soundproofed room could even register the breach, a tidal wave of tactical federal agents flooded the space. They poured through the doorway in heavy, dark body armor, their tactical boots stomping heavily against the floorboards. The visual shock of heavily armed federal law enforcement storming into a lavish mahogany library was absolute and paralyzing. "FBI, nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them." The commanding shouts of the tactical team leader echoed relentlessly off the towering bookshelves, completely shattering the aristocratic silence of the room. David tried to scramble to his feet, crying out something incoherent about an insurance misunderstanding. Two agents were on him in a heartbeat. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his expensive tailored suit, shoved him face first against the wall, and forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around David's wrists sounded like music to my ears. He sobbed openly, emitting a pathetic high-pitched wail of pure cowardice. Jamal immediately tried to deploy his corporate lawyer persona. He raised his hands, pasting a fake diplomatic smile onto his sweating face. "Officers, there is a massive jurisdictional misunderstanding here. I am a senior partner at a very prestigious firm, and you are currently trespassing on private property." "Shut your mouth and turn around," a burly federal agent ordered, stepping right into Jamal's personal space. Jamal hesitated, his massive ego struggling to comprehend that his prestigious title meant absolutely nothing in this room. The agent grabbed Jamal by the lapels, spun him around roughly, and slammed him chest first onto the surface of his own mahogany desk, pressing his face right over the shredded pieces of my father's hush money check. Jamal grunted in pain as the cuffs bit tightly into his wrists. The untouchable legal mastermind was officially in federal custody. Harrison, completely blinded by his lifelong entitlement, actually attempted to resist. He puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively toward the agents. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I demand to speak to the agent in charge. I play golf with the federal prosecutor for this district." The tactical team did not care about his golf partners. An agent grabbed Harrison by his custom silk tie, swept his leg, and brought the massive patriarch crashing down onto the floor. Harrison gasped for air, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as the agent secured his wrists. Caroline let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, shrinking back against the fireplace as she watched her powerful husband and wealthy son-in-law get treated like common street criminals. Chelsea stood completely frozen. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and totally vacant as she watched the federal agents secure the room. Her perfect, meticulously planned life was disintegrating right in front of her eyes, and her brain simply refused to process the terrifying reality of the situation. "Clear the room and secure the targets," Agent Reyes commanded, stepping through the doorway. He wore his dark trench coat, his face a mask of absolute professional stone. He looked at me, giving a sharp, definitive nod. "We have the perimeter locked down. The entire property is surrounded." I did not wait for his permission. I turned my back on the pathetic, weeping figures of my husband and my father, and I walked straight out of the library. The scene in the grand foyer was a picture of absolute, unadulterated pandemonium. The live string quartet had completely stopped playing. Cellos and violins were abandoned on their stands. The towering champagne fountain sat ignored. The region's absolute elite, the judges, the corporate executives, the local politicians, were standing frozen in sheer terror. They were pinned against the edges of the room by federal agents guarding the main exits. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the main foyer, just as the agents began dragging Jamal Harrison and David out of the library. The gasp that swept through the high society crowd was deafening. These wealthy guests were watching the prominent, respected Blackwell family get paraded through their own lavish party in steel handcuffs. Jamal kept his head down, desperately trying to hide his face from his powerful colleagues. Harrison was still shouting empty, desperate threats at the agents, permanently sealing his own social destruction. But I did not care about their public humiliation. My eyes darted frantically around the massive space, searching the grand, sweeping staircase. Then I saw him. Agent Reyes was walking briskly down the carpeted stairs. Resting safely in his strong arms, clutching the federal agent's dark jacket tightly, was my son. Leo was crying softly, clearly overwhelmed by the flashing lights visible through the front windows and the loud commands echoing in the massive house. But he was safe. He was completely unharmed. "Leo." I called out, my voice cracking with overwhelming relief. Leo lifted his head. He saw me standing at the bottom of the stairs. "Mommy," he cried, wiggling frantically out of Agent Reyes's grip. The agent gently set him down on the marble floor. Leo ran to me with everything he had. I dropped to my knees, hitting the hard marble floor without feeling a single ounce of pain. I caught him in my arms, wrapping him up in the fiercest, most protective embrace of my entire life. I buried my face in his neck, inhaling deeply. "I am here, baby," I whispered, holding him so tight my arms ached. "I am right here. You are safe now. We are going home." Leo sobbed against my collarbone, wrapping his tiny arms tightly around my neck. The heavy, suffocating terror of the past 24 hours instantly washed away. I had my son. I had won the war. As I stood up, carrying Leo securely on my hip, Chelsea stumbled out of the hallway and into the grand foyer. She looked absolutely deranged. Her perfectly styled hair was falling out in messy strands. Her emerald green gown looked utterly ridiculous against the harsh backdrop of federal tactical gear. She looked around the room, making direct eye contact with the wealthy socialites and judges who were staring at her with blatant disgust. They already knew what she had done. The rumors were spreading like wildfire through the trapped crowd. Chelsea let out a raw, guttural scream of pure agony. She dropped hard onto her knees right in the middle of the foyer. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her on the marble floor. She slammed her fists against the ground, screaming hysterically, throwing a massive, unhinged tantrum in front of the entire elite community she so desperately wanted to impress. Her flawless world had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "Jamal, fix it!" Chelsea screamed, sobbing wildly as the agents dragged her husband out the front doors. "Do something! You promised me!" Caroline rushed out of the hallway next, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She saw me walking toward the front exit with Leo in my arms. Pure desperation took over her completely. Caroline ran toward me, her hands reaching out to grab the sleeve of my blazer. "Clara, please!" Caroline begged, her voice cracking pitifully. She was crying genuine tears of absolute terror. "Please tell them to stop. Tell them it is a huge misunderstanding. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot let them take your father away. You cannot do this to us." I stopped walking. I turned my head and looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had left a severed tracking bracelet on my front porch. I looked at the woman who had called me a working-class accountant and bought my son like a piece of commercial property. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults. I simply stared at her with a look of absolute freezing emptiness. I pulled my arm out of her frantic grasp, adjusted my firm hold on my beautiful son, and turned my back on her forever. I walked straight out the heavy oak doors, past the screaming sister on the floor, past the sobbing mother begging for mercy, and stepped out into the cool night air illuminated by a sea of flashing federal lights. I walked past them without uttering a single word. 6 months have passed since the night the federal government tore my toxic family's empire down to its very foundation. The justice system moves slowly, but when it possesses a flawless digital trail of wire fraud, money laundering, and federal kidnapping, it moves with absolute devastating certainty. The ruthless reckoning they faced was spectacular, a perfect domino effect of consequences that entirely eradicated the arrogant lives they had built. David took a plea deal the exact second his overworked public defender saw the encrypted evidence dossier I handed to Agent Reyes. He is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a medium-security federal facility upstate. The illegal offshore sports betting syndicate he owed money to was also exposed during the financial raid, meaning he will likely spend his entire prison sentence looking nervously over his shoulder. The cowardly man who happily sold his adopted son to save his own skin now lives in a tiny concrete box, stripped of his tailored suits, his expensive bourbon, and his prestigious corporate career. He lost absolutely everything. Jamal suffered the most catastrophic professional destruction imaginable. The State Bar Association moved with unprecedented ruthless speed, permanently stripping him of his license to practice law. His prestigious corporate firm, terrified of the massive federal fallout, completely severed ties with him overnight. He is currently awaiting his own federal trial, facing up to 20 years in federal prison for utilizing his firm's legal trust accounts to wash extortion money across state boundaries. The brilliant, arrogant mastermind was ultimately brought down by his own monumental hubris. My parents, Harrison and Caroline, faced a completely different kind of ruin. The Internal Revenue Service, aggressively alerted by Agent Reyes's task force, initiated a massive forensic audit of their corporate holding accounts. The federal government seized their primary estate, froze their remaining liquid assets, and issued crushing financial penalties for their role in the bribery scheme. They were forced to declare total humiliating bankruptcy. Their elite social circle, the judges, the politicians, and the wealthy investors who had witnessed the raid at the mansion, completely abandoned them overnight. They became absolute social pariahs, permanently exiled from the country clubs and high society galas that had defined their entire miserable existence. And Chelsea, my golden child sister, completely unraveled. With Jamal facing federal prison and her parents completely bankrupt, the illusion of her perfect life dissolved into ash. She currently lives alone in a small rented apartment, a lonely, empty shell of the arrogant socialite she used to be. The child she tried to purchase is gone, and her pristine reputation is entirely destroyed. I had completely changed my phone number, severed all digital connections, and moved across the country to ensure they could never reach me again. But desperate people always find a way to crawl out of the woodwork. Just yesterday, my secure phone rang with an incoming call from an untraceable prepaid number. I answered cautiously, recording the call out of pure ingrained habit. Clara, a ragged, weeping voice, croaked through the receiver. It was Caroline. I did not say a single word. I just sat in my home office and listened to the pathetic sound of the woman who had ruined my childhood and tried to steal my son. Clara, please. Caroline begged, her voice thick with desperate, gasping tears. We have lost absolutely everything. Your father is sick. We are living in a tiny, awful apartment. We cannot afford our legal fees. You have to help us. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just leave us like this. I let her cry for exactly 10 seconds. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sterile indifference. You sold your blood the night you left that box on my doorstep, I stated, my voice slicing through the line like a razor. I hit the end call button immediately. I took the phone, removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and threw it into the trash. That was the absolute last time I would ever hear her voice. Today, Leo and I are thriving. We relocated to a vibrant, sunny city thousands of miles away from the toxic wasteland of my past. I opened my own independent forensic accounting firm, operating entirely on my own terms. Leo is doing wonderfully in his new school. His laughter fills our new home every single day. The terrified boy in the stiff tuxedo is gone, replaced by a happy, energetic child who knows without a shadow of a doubt that his mother will burn the entire world down to keep him safe. I share this story because society constantly conditions us to forgive our relatives simply because we share DNA. We are told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to accept abuse disguised as familial obligation. But family is supposed to be your safe harbor, not the storm that tries to sink you. Love is not transactional, and children are not commodities to be traded for social status or financial salvation. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, if you are being manipulated, gaslighted, or made to feel like you are never enough, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You possess the power to walk away. You have the right to sever the ties that are dragging you under. If you have survived the unthinkable, tell me your story in the comments. Let your voice be heard. Hit the like button and subscribe to join a community of survivors who refuse to be victims anymore. And remember, never let anyone put a price tag on your peace.